I built a $2 million life so my wife could sleep with a guy who drove a rusted 20-year-old pickup truck. But the worst part wasn't the cheating. It was the moment I caught them. Instead of crying, hiding, or begging for forgiveness, my wife took a sip of her expensive Chardonnay, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Are you done staring? You're ruining the mood." My name is Arthur, and this is how I systematically destroyed the life of the most brazen, arrogant woman I ever loved. If you've been married for over 20 years, you know the drill. You put your head down, you work your fingers to the bone, and you provide. You build the nest. For 25 years, that's exactly what I did. I own a mid-sized commercial HVAC company. It's not glamorous work. It's early mornings, late nights, dirt, sweat, and stress. But it paid for the 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. It paid for the European vacations. And it paid for my wife, Sarah, to live a life of absolute, unfiltered leisure. Sarah was 48, but if you looked at her, you'd swear she just turned 35. She spent her days at Pilates, high-end salons, and having lunch with women who complained about their husbands' golf habits. Over the last few years, she had evolved from a supportive partner into someone I barely recognized. She became cold, entitled, snarky. She treated me less like a husband and more like an annoying ATM machine that occasionally lived in her house. Whenever I tried to talk to her about the distance between us, she'd roll her eyes. "Oh, please, Arthur," she'd say, waving her perfectly manicured hand. "Stop being so dramatic. We're in our 50s, not teenagers in a rom-com. Grow up." I accepted it. I thought that's just what happens when the kids move out and the fire dies down. I was a fool. There was a fire, all right. It just wasn't burning for me. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October. I was supposed to be in Dallas for a 3-day contractor convention, but my morning flight got delayed, then canceled due to severe storms in the Midwest. Instead of waiting at the airport for a rebooking, I decided to just go home, surprise Sarah, and maybe take her out for a nice midweek steak dinner. I didn't call her. I didn't think I needed to. It was my house. I took an Uber from the airport because I had left my truck in the long-term parking lot. When the driver dropped me off, the first thing I noticed was a beat-up black Ford Ranger parked directly in my driveway. It had a cracked taillight, rust along the wheel wells, and a sticker on the bumper that I won't repeat here. It was leaking oil onto my pristine, power-washed concrete. I didn't immediately think cheating. I thought maybe the plumber was there or a handyman. I grabbed my suitcase, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. But there was a smell. It hit me before I even made it to the kitchen. The heavy, lingering scent of cheap tobacco, mixed with a musky, dollar store cologne. I hate cigarette smoke. Sarah knows I hate cigarette smoke. She wouldn't even let my own brother smoke on the back patio. I left my suitcase in the foyer. I walked toward the back of the house, where the large glass sliding doors led to the deck I had built with my own 2 hands. Through the glass, I saw them. My heart didn't just drop. It completely stopped beating. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline flood my veins, making my hands go numb. Sitting on one of my expensive outdoor lounge chairs was a man. He looked to be in his early 40s. Unshaven, wearing a dirty gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed work boots. He had a tattoo creeping up the side of his neck. He was leaning back, casually smoking a cigarette, dropping the ashes right onto the mahogany wood of my deck. And sitting on his lap, wearing nothing but one of my white button-down dress shirts, was my wife. My beautiful, refined, elegant wife. Her arms were wrapped around his neck, and she was laughing. A loud, carefree laugh I hadn't heard aimed at me in over a decade. I slid the glass door open. It made a loud scraping sound. They both turned their heads. Any normal woman would have jumped up. She would have screamed, tried to cover herself, or started stammering out an excuse. Not Sarah. Sarah just stopped laughing. She looked at me, let out a long, irritated sigh, and didn't move an inch off the guy's lap. "You're supposed to be in Dallas, Arthur," she said. Her voice wasn't panicked. It was annoyed. like I was a telemarketer interrupting her dinner. I was paralyzed. My brain couldn't process the sheer audacity of what I was looking at. "Sarah," I choked out, my voice sounding weak, unfamiliar. What is this?" The man on her lap took a slow, deliberate drag of his cigarette. He didn't look scared either. In fact, he looked amused. He blew the smoke out into the autumn air, locked eyes with me, and smirked. "I'm guessing you're the husband," he said. His voice was gravelly, completely devoid of respect. He didn't even shift his weight. He just patted Sarah's hip as if she were a pet. "Nice deck, by the way. Good craftsmanship, though the joists underneath look a little warped." "Get out," I said, my voice finally finding its base. "Get the hell off my property right now." The guy chuckled, taking a sip from a beer bottle that I recognized from my own premium stash in the garage fridge. "Relax, old man. I'm just finishing my drink." I took a step forward, my fists clenching. "I'm 52, but I haul industrial air conditioning units for a living. I'm not a small man." I said, "Get the hell out." Before the man could respond, Sarah finally stood up. She casually pulled the front of my shirt together, completely unashamed of her bare legs. She walked up to me, smelling of sex and his cheap cologne, and pointed a finger at my chest. "Stop making a scene in my backyard, Arthur," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You're embarrassing yourself. Go inside. We're done out here anyway." She turned her back to me, walked over to the man, and gave him a soft kiss on the cheek. "I'll call you later, Vance," she said softly. Vance stood up, stretched lazily, and tossed his cigarette butt onto my manicured lawn. He walked past me, deliberately bumping his shoulder into mine. "See you around, Artie," he muttered, walking through my house to the front door. I stood there on the deck, listening to the heavy thud of his boots on my hardwood floors, followed by the sound of his rusted truck starting up in the driveway. Sarah walked past me into the kitchen, heading straight for the wine fridge. She poured herself a glass, leaned against the marble counter I paid $50,000 for, and looked at me. "Well?" she said, taking a sip. "Are you going to stand out there catching flies, or are you going to come in and yell at me like a cliché?" It was in that exact second that the rage inside me turned ice cold. If she had cried, I might have filed for a standard divorce. If she had begged, I might have just walked away and split the assets. But looking at her arrogant smirk, knowing she thought she was completely untouchable because she had her name on half of everything I owned, I realized a divorce wasn't going to be enough. I didn't yell. I didn't break down. I walked inside, looked at her and said, "I'm going to a hotel. Have the house cleaned by tomorrow." I turned around and walked out. I didn't know exactly what my plan was yet, but I knew one thing for absolute certain. By the time I was done with Sarah and her grease monkey lover, they wouldn't have a single penny or an ounce of pride left between them. If there is one thing running a commercial HVAC business for 3 decades teaches you, it's how to diagnose a catastrophic failure. When a 50-ton chiller unit goes down in the middle of July, you don't stand around crying about the heat. You don't scream at the broken compressor. You shut off the main power, you pull out your schematics, and you systematically dismantle the machine until you find the exact point of failure. Then, you rip the rotten parts out. Sitting in a sterile room at the Marriott, staring at the popcorn ceiling, I applied that exact same logic to my 25-year marriage. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't drink. I just opened my laptop and started digging. I didn't need hidden cameras. I didn't need to hire a sleazy private investigator to follow them around or hack into her phone. People who are that arrogant are also profoundly lazy. Sarah felt completely untouchable, which meant she was careless. All I had to do was look at the numbers. The numbers never lie. I logged into our joint banking portal and pulled the American Express statements for the last 8 months. The picture painted by the transaction history was so humiliating it actually made my stomach turn. Sarah wasn't just sleeping with a mechanic. She was sponsoring him. I scrolled through page after page of charges. $400 at a Red Wing boot store. $850 at a custom truck accessories shop. Undoubtedly for that rusted-out Ford Ranger leaking oil on my driveway. There were countless charges for midday tabs at local dive bars, heavy cash withdrawals from ATMs in the bad part of town, and a staggering $1,200 bill for a premium Yeti cooler and fishing gear. I was working 14-hour days, breathing in fiberglass insulation and Freon, to finance a perpetual weekend for my wife and her grifter boyfriend. She was literally swiping the card with my name on it to pay for his beer. By 6 a.m., my sorrow was completely gone, burned away by a cold, calculating rage. I closed my laptop, took a shower, and put my suit back on. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to the downtown offices of David Sterling. David wasn't a family law attorney. He was my corporate lawyer. He was the guy I used when a general contractor tried to stiff me on a $500,000 invoice, or when a supplier tried to breach contract. David was a shark in a tailored suit, a man devoid of sentimentality. When I sat in his leather chair and told him what had happened, he didn't offer me a tissue or a sympathetic nod. He just clicked his pen. "So, Arthur," David said, his voice flat. "Do you want to leave her, or do you want to ruin her?" "Both," I replied without hesitating. "But she thinks she has me by the throat. We live in a community property state, David. She thinks if I leave, she gets the house, half the business, half the retirement, and a fat alimony check to keep funding her new lifestyle. I want to know how to gut the structure before I tear the building down." David smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "The business is an LLC, and you are the sole managing member. She's entitled to its value in a divorce, yes, but value is a very subjective, very fluid concept. If the company were to, say, take on massive, sudden debt for expansion, debt secured against the business assets, its liquid value would plummet. If you were to start a new, separate holding company, well, there are legal mechanisms to bleed a company's cash flow dry before a judge ever sees a financial affidavit. We spent 4 hours mapping it out. It was going to take time. It was going to require me to swallow my pride and go back to that house and look the woman who betrayed me in the eye every single day without letting her know the floorboards were rotting beneath her feet. I arrived back at my house around 4 p.m. The place was spotless, just as I had demanded. The lingering smell of cheap tobacco and stale cologne was gone, replaced by the scent of expensive lavender diffusers. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen island, idly flipping through a Vogue magazine, a cup of espresso in her hand. She was wearing a silk robe that I had bought her for our anniversary in Paris. When she heard me walk in, she didn't flinch. She just slowly turned a page. "Well," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "did you get it out of your system? Are you done throwing your little hotel tantrum?" I forced my hands to relax. I let my shoulders slump. I had to play the part of the defeated, desperate, aging husband who was too terrified of being alone to pull the plug. "I'm here, aren't I said quietly, looking down at the floor. Sarah let out a small, victorious scoff. She closed the magazine and finally looked at me. "Good, because frankly, Arthur, your reaction yesterday was childish. We are adults. I have needs. You are always working. Did you honestly expect me to just sit around here knitting sweaters until I died? So, Vance," I forced the name out of my mouth like a piece of glass. "Is he a permanent fixture?" She took a slow sip of her espresso, her eyes locking onto mine with an icy confidence. "Vance is fun, Arthur. He's spontaneous. He doesn't talk to me about profit margins or supply chain issues. He makes me feel alive. I'm not leaving you if that's what you're worried about. I like my life. I like this house, but I'm not going to stop seeing him either. So you need to decide if you can live in the real world or if you want to blow up 25 years of marriage over my private life." She was dictating terms. She was openly telling me she was going to keep sleeping with this dirtbag, on my dime, and daring me to do something about it. She felt completely secure in the knowledge that she held half my empire hostage. I took a deep breath, channeled every ounce of willpower I possessed, and delivered the line that would seal her fate. "I don't want a divorce, Sarah," I said. my voice trembling just enough to be convincing. I just can't lose you. I'll try to understand." A slow, wicked smirk spread across her face. The look of utter contempt in her eyes was unmistakable. She looked at me not as a man, but as a beaten dog that had just rolled over and exposed its belly. "I knew you'd see reason, Arthur," she purred, sliding off the stool. She walked past me, stopping just long enough to pat my shoulder as if I were an obedient child. "I'm going out for a few hours. Don't wait up." I watched her walk to the garage and get into her Mercedes, the one I paid off 2 years ago. I listened to the engine purr, the garage door open, and the tires roll down the driveway. I stood alone in my quiet, spotless kitchen. I didn't feel weak anymore. I pulled out my phone, opened my contacts, and sent a single text message to my lawyer, David. "The facade is up. Start the transfers." She thought she had tamed me. She had no idea she had just locked herself in the cage with a predator. The next 6 months were a masterclass in psychological warfare. To the outside world, and more importantly, to Sarah, I was the picture of a broken, compliant husband. I stopped asking questions. I started working even longer hours. I even started leaving the house on weekends, telling her I had site inspections, just so she and Vance could have the place to themselves. I knew he was there. I'd come home to find the toilet seat up in the guest bathroom, or a stray beer cap on the counter, or the faint, lingering smell of his cheap cologne in the hallways. I swallowed the bile that rose in my throat every single time. I played my part perfectly, because while she was busy playing house with a mechanic on my dime, I was busy dismantling the dime. David Sterling, my corporate lawyer, was a genius. Together with a forensic accountant he brought in, we initiated Project Starve. My HVAC company, Arctic Air Commercial, was a cash cow. But on paper, we began to make it look like a dying beast. We started taking on massive, high-interest corporate loans. The justification was a major expansion into the tri-state area. The board, which consisted solely of me, approved the loans. But the money didn't go into expansion. It was funneled into a newly formed, completely separate holding company, an LLC registered in Delaware, entirely under the name of a trust that Sarah had absolutely no legal ties to. We used the loan money to buy out heavy machinery and real estate, effectively stripping the cash liquidity out of Arctic Air. To the IRS, it was perfectly legal corporate restructuring. To a divorce judge looking at a balance sheet, Arctic Air suddenly had a terrifying debt-to-income ratio. Its valuation plummeted from around $4 million to barely breaking even. But I didn't stop at the business. I went after the personal finances. Sarah's entire existence was funded by our joint accounts. I couldn't just close them without raising red flags. Instead, I slowly choked them. I changed the direct deposit from my company's payroll. Only 20% of my actual salary went into the joint account, just enough to cover the mortgage and basic utilities. The other 80% was redirected into a private, offshore account David had set up. When Sarah's credit cards inevitably started getting declined at the salon or the boutique, she would storm into my home office, furious. "Arthur, my Amex was declined at Nordstrom today. It was humiliating. What the hell is going on?" I'd look up from my desk, rubbing my eyes, playing the stressed, failing provider. "I'm sorry, Sarah. The business it's taking a massive hit. The supply chain issues, the cost of Freon. We just lost 2 major contracts. We are hemorrhaging money. I had to max out the credit lines just to make payroll this month." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Well, figure it out, Arthur. I am not living like a peasant because you don't know how to run your own company." "I'm trying," I'd say, keeping my voice meek. "But you're going to have to cut back. No more $1,000 shopping sprees, and—" I hesitated, letting my voice crack slightly. "You might have to tell Vance to start paying for his own beer." The look of sheer disgust she gave me was worth its weight in gold. She didn't suspect a thing. She just thought I was a failure. She believed the money was gone, and because of her absolute arrogance, she didn't bother to hire an accountant to check my work. She was too busy sneaking around to notice the house was being sold out from under her. Speaking of the house, that was my favorite piece of the puzzle. We lived in a prime real estate market. The house was paid off, worth roughly $1.2 million. It was our biggest joint asset. Under normal divorce proceedings, she'd force a sale and take half, or force me to buy her out. I wasn't going to let her see a penny of it. I took out a massive home equity line of credit, HELOC. Because she was on the deed, I needed her signature. I brought the paperwork to her while she was getting a pedicure. I told her the business needed an emergency cash injection to avoid bankruptcy, and if she didn't sign, we'd lose everything, including her Mercedes. She signed it without even reading the second page. I maxed out the HELOC the very next day. I took $800,000 in cash against the house. I dumped it straight into the Delaware Trust. Now, the house was leveraged to the hilt. The equity was gone. If she tried to take the house in a divorce, she'd be taking on $800,000 of debt with no income to pay it. By month 7, the trap was fully set. The safety nets were cut. The parachute was packed with anvils. On paper, Arthur was a man on the brink of financial ruin, drowning in corporate and personal debt. In reality, Arthur's wealth was safely locked in an impenetrable legal fortress. It was time to drop the hammer. But I didn't want to just serve her papers. I wanted to break her reality. I wanted Vance to be there. I wanted him to see exactly what happens when a parasite realizes the host is dead. I waited for the perfect moment. It came on a Friday in April. Sarah told me she was going to a weekend spa retreat with her girlfriends. I knew exactly what that meant. I checked the joint account tracker. She had booked a 2-night stay at a luxury cabin up in the mountains. 2 adults. I packed a small overnight bag, put my golf clubs in the trunk, and told her I was staying at a buddy's place for a golf tournament. We kissed each other goodbye in the kitchen, a cold, empty peck. "Have fun at the spa," I said, looking her right in the eyes. "Have fun at golf," she replied, not even bothering to look up from her phone. I drove away, but I didn't go to a golf course. I drove to the local county courthouse. I walked into the clerk's office and officially filed the divorce petition. No warnings, no mediation. Then, I drove back to the house. I packed all of my clothes, my valuables, and my tools. I loaded everything into my truck. I left the house completely bare of my existence. Before I walked out the door for the last time, I left a manila envelope on the kitchen island. Inside were the divorce papers, a printout of the mountain cabin reservation showing Vance's name as the secondary guest, and a heavily redacted financial statement showing the staggering amount of debt the company and the house were currently in. I taped a single note to the front of the envelope. "The ATM is broken. Good luck paying the mortgage." I drove to my new apartment downtown, a place I had secured months ago. I poured myself a glass of 20-year-old scotch, sat on my new leather couch, and waited for her to return from her romantic getaway. The countdown to detonation had officially begun. Sunday evening arrived with a quiet stillness that I hadn't felt in decades. I was sitting in my new downtown apartment, the city lights reflecting off the window glass. I had a pour of 20-year-old Macallan in my hand. It was exactly 7:12 p.m. when my phone screen lit up. Caller ID, Sarah. I didn't answer. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. She called 5 times in a row. On the 6th attempt, I set my glass down, cleared my throat, and pressed accept. I didn't say a word. I just listened. "Arthur, what the hell is this?" Her voice wasn't tearful. It was shrill, echoing with the familiar, piercing entitlement I had endured for years. "Where is half the furniture? Where are your clothes? And what kind of sick joke is this envelope on the counter?" I took a slow breath. "It's not a joke, Sarah. It's a divorce petition. You've been served." She let out a harsh, barking laugh. It was the sound of a woman who still fundamentally believed she held all the cards. "You idiot," she sneered. "You absolute pathetic idiot. You think you can just walk out on me? We live in a 50-50 state, Arthur. You just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I'm calling a lawyer first thing tomorrow. I am going to take the house. I'm going to take half of that stupid air conditioning business, and you are going to pay me alimony until the day you die. I'll make sure you're living in a cardboard box." I let her finish. I let her exhaust the last remaining reserves of her arrogance. Then I spoke. My voice was dangerously calm, low, and completely devoid of the weakness she was accustomed to hearing. "Take it," I said. There was a pause on the line. "What?" she snapped. "I said take it, Sarah. Take the house. But before you call your lawyer, you might want to look at the second page of that financial disclosure in the envelope. The house is leveraged to the absolute limit. Remember that paperwork you signed back in February while you were getting a pedicure? The emergency business loan?" Silence. "That was a home equity line of credit," I continued, my voice steady and surgical. "You signed away the equity. The house currently has $800,000 of debt attached to it. If you take the house, you take the mortgage, and you take the HELOC. Without my income, the bank will foreclose on you in 60 days. You're lying," she stammered, the first microscopic crack of panic finally appearing in her voice. "The business makes millions. I'll take half of that." "The business," I corrected her, "is currently drowning in $1.5 million of high-interest corporate debt. It has zero liquid cash. Its valuation is virtually nothing. If you want half the business, you're assuming half of that corporate liability. So go ahead, Sarah. Take half of nothing. Take half of a mountain of debt. You wanted to live in the real world? Welcome to it." I could hear her hyperventilating on the other end. The reality was crashing down on her like a concrete block. She had never managed our finances. She had never balanced a checkbook. She had just swiped the card. "You can't do this!" she screamed, her voice finally breaking. "My credit cards are getting declined. I tried to buy gas on the way down the mountain and my Amex was shut off. You have to turn them back on, Arthur. This is financial abuse." "No, Sarah. Funding your boyfriend's lifestyle with my sweat and blood was abuse. The ATM is broken." Suddenly, I heard a scuffle on the other end of the line. Another voice came through the speaker. It was gravelly, irritated, and familiar. It was Vance. "Listen here, you piece of garbage," Vance barked into the phone, trying to sound intimidating. "You can't just leave her high and dry like this. She's your wife. You owe her. You better transfer some cash into her account right now, or I'm going to come down there and beat the hell out of you myself." I actually smiled. It was the cherry on top of the sundae. "Vance," I said, my tone dripping with amusement. "I'm so glad you're there. I don't owe her a dime." But more importantly, she doesn't have a dime. Her accounts are frozen. The credit cards are dead. There will be no more $100 bar tabs, no more fishing gear, no more trips to the cabin. You wanted a sugar mama, Vance? Well, your sugar mama is broke, heavily in debt, and about to be homeless. "Shut up," Vance yelled, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He wasn't stupid. He was a parasite, and parasites know when the host has been bled dry. "Let's see how much you love her now, Vance," I whispered into the phone. "Let's see if you stick around when she's begging you to get a second job so she can pay the electric bill. Have a great life together." I hung up the phone. I opened my settings, blocked her number, and took a long, satisfying sip of my scotch. The fallout over the next 2 weeks was a masterpiece of legal destruction. Sarah managed to scrape together enough cash, probably by pawning the diamond earrings I bought her for our 20th anniversary, to hire a flashy, aggressive divorce attorney. He sent my lawyer, David, a threatening email full of bluster, demanding immediate spousal support, exclusive use of the marital home, and a forensic accounting of the business. David didn't fight back. He happily handed over everything. He gave them the bank statements, the loan documents, the HELOC signatures, and the corporate tax returns. It took Sarah's lawyer exactly 48 hours to realize there was absolutely no money to extract. In divorce law, attorneys only fight when there is a treasure chest to split, because that's how they get paid. When her lawyer realized the estate had a negative net worth and that Sarah had zero income to pay his hourly rate, he dropped her as a client. She was completely isolated. She couldn't afford the property taxes, let alone the mortgage. The utility company started sending shut-off notices. And Vance? Vance reacted exactly the way I knew he would. He wasn't a romantic. He was an opportunist. When the free beer stopped flowing, and the reality of dealing with a panicked, destitute, aging woman set in, the fun and spontaneous mechanic suddenly lost his charm. According to a mutual neighbor who kept me updated, Vance lasted less than 3 weeks. The neighbor told me they had a screaming match on the front lawn. Sarah was sobbing, begging him to stay, asking him to help her figure things out. Vance just threw his duffel bag into the back of his rusted Ford Ranger. "I ain't signing up for your debt, lady," he had yelled for the whole neighborhood to hear. "You're crazy if you think I'm paying your mortgage." He got in his truck, backed out of my driveway, and drove away, leaving a fresh oil stain on the concrete. He left her standing there on the manicured lawn, completely alone, completely broke, and entirely broken. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final move to make to ensure that the ashes of her betrayal were swept away for good. The silence of my new life was intoxicating. For 25 years, I had lived with a low-level hum of anxiety, constantly trying to please a woman who viewed me as nothing more than a utility. Now, sitting in my downtown apartment, watching the city wake up, I felt a profound, heavy peace. But the paperwork wasn't finished yet. There was one final nail to drive into the coffin. 60 days after I walked out, Sarah was completely cornered. The bank was threatening foreclosure on the mortgage. The holding company, which I secretly controlled through the Delaware Trust, was preparing to call in the $800,000 HELOC debt. Her Mercedes was 2 months behind on payments and in danger of being repossessed. She had no lawyer. She had no Vance. She had no family willing to loan her the kind of money she needed. I received an email from her directly. It wasn't demanding or arrogant. It was a single, pathetic sentence. "Please, Arthur, I have nowhere to go. Let's just talk." I agreed to meet her, but not at the house. I made her come to David Sterling's office. I wanted her on my turf, under the cold, fluorescent lights of a legal boardroom. When she walked through the glass doors, I actually had to do a double take. The woman standing before me looked nothing like the arrogant, impeccably groomed socialite who had sipped Chardonnay while a mechanic put his hands all over her. Her hair was unkempt, showing a harsh gray line at the roots she could no longer afford to dye. She was wearing plain jeans and a faded sweater. The designer bags and diamond rings were gone, undoubtedly sold to keep the lights on for the past 2 months. She looked every bit of her 48 years, and then some. She sat across the heavy mahogany table from me. She wouldn't make eye contact. She just stared at her hands, which were shaking slightly. "I'm going bankrupt, Arthur," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The house. They're going to take it. The credit card companies are calling me 10 times a day. I applied for a job at a boutique downtown, but they said I don't have any recent retail experience." She looked up at me, tears finally welling in her eyes. It was the crying I had expected on the day I caught her, but it was far too late for tears. "I made a mistake," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Vance was a mistake. He left me. He took the Yeti cooler you bought, and he just left. I was stupid. I took you for granted. Please, you have to help me fix this. We can fix this." I sat back in my leather chair. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I didn't feel anger either. I just felt an overwhelming sense of closure. I looked at David, who gave me a subtle nod, sliding a thin manila folder across the table toward her. "We aren't fixing anything, Sarah," I said, my voice completely flat. "But I am going to offer you a way out. One time, one offer, you decline it, and you walk out of this office, and I let the banks bury you." She looked up, sniffing, staring at the folder as if it were a lifeline. "Inside that folder is a settlement agreement and a quit-claim deed," I explained, leaning forward. "You will sign over your 50% ownership of the house to the Delaware Trust. You will officially relinquish any and all claims to Arctic Air Commercial and its assets. You will sign an agreement waiving your right to any spousal support or alimony." But what about the debt?" she stammered. "What about the loans?" "If you sign," I continued, "the trust will assume full responsibility for the mortgage and the HELOC. The business will assume its own corporate debt. You will walk away clean. No bankruptcy. No foreclosures on your public record. Furthermore, I will cut you a one-time cashier's check for $10,000. That is enough to rent a modest apartment and buy a used Honda. After that, you are entirely on your own." Her eyes went wide. "$10,000? Arthur, I can't live on $10,000. I've been your wife for 25 years. I deserve—" "You deserve exactly what you earned," I cut her off, my voice dropping to a dangerous baritone that made her flinch. "You spent 25 years living like a queen on my dime, and you thanked me by bringing a parasite into my home and disrespecting me to my face. You thought you were untouchable. You thought I was a weak, tired old man who would just roll over. You were wrong." I tapped the folder with my index finger. "Sign the papers, Sarah. Take the 10 grand. Go get a job, or walk out that door and deal with $1 million of debt on your own. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide." She stared at me. She searched my face for any hint of the man who used to buy her apology gifts when she was the one who started a fight. She found nothing but stone. Her shoulders slumped. The last remaining ounce of her defiance evaporated into the sterile air of the boardroom. She picked up the pen with a trembling hand, opened the folder, and signed her name on every single line David pointed to. When she was finished, David handed her a cashier's check. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say goodbye. She just stood up, clutching the envelope to her chest, and walked out of the office. The divorce was finalized smoothly shortly after. Once the ink was dry and the decree was stamped by the judge, the financial illusions were disassembled. The Delaware Trust, which I was the sole beneficiary of, officially took possession of the house. I sold it 2 months later to a young tech couple for $1.3 million, paying off the debt and pocketing a massive profit. Arctic Air Commercial miraculously recovered. Without Sarah bleeding my accounts dry, and with the holding company merging back into the primary LLC, my business was stronger than ever. I bought a boat. I started taking weekends off. I actually started living. I only saw Sarah one more time. It was about a year later. I was driving out to a new commercial job site in the suburbs, and I stopped at a local big-box hardware store to grab a specific gauge of wire my guys needed. I was standing in the checkout line. The cashier was struggling with the register, her back turned as she tried to scan a heavy bag of concrete for the contractor in front of me. She turned around to hand the man his receipt. It was Sarah. She was wearing a red synthetic uniform vest over a plain polo shirt. Her hair was entirely gray now, tied back in a messy ponytail. Her hands, which used to be perfectly manicured, looked dry and calloused. I stepped up to the register and set my spool of wire on the metal counter. She looked up, her standard retail greeting dying in her throat. She froze. Her face went completely pale, her eyes darting from my expensive leather work boots to my custom-fitted jacket, and finally to my face. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a single word. I just pulled out my wallet, handed her a $50 bill, and waited. Her hands shook violently as she processed the transaction. She handed me my change, her eyes firmly glued to the floor. She couldn't even bring herself to look at me again. I took my receipt, picked up my wire, and walked out into the bright morning sun. If there is a lesson in all of this for the guys out there listening, it's this. Never let a person's arrogance convince you that you are powerless. The loudest, most disrespectful people in the room are usually the most fragile. They rely on your silence. They rely on your fear of conflict. Don't give them your anger. Give them your absence. Work in the shadows, build your fortress, and when the time is right, let reality do the heavy lifting. I built a $2 million life, and when my wife decided to burn it down, I simply made sure she was the only one standing in the fire. My name is Arthur, and I've never slept better in my entire life.